When I married Andrew, he was working for my father, which is how we first crossed paths. After our wedding, we decided I would stay home so I could pursue my hobbies, sewing and knitting being the ones I cherished most. I loved making scarves and gloves for him each winter. Over time, my skills improved, and he proudly started comparing my handmade pieces to store-bought ones. His encouragement fueled my passion, and I dreamed of sharing this love for crafting with our future child, a thought that always brought a smile to our faces. We've been married for 6 years now. Although we haven't had children, our life together has been fulfilling. Despite his demanding job, Andrew always made an effort to spend time with me when he could, and that meant everything. Still, there were times when his work made me feel more like an afterthought than a partner. Our quiet life was disrupted 3 years ago when I suddenly collapsed at home. Dizzy and weak, Andrew rushed me to the hospital, where I woke up to hear him discussing my condition with the doctor. The diagnosis was serious, a chronic condition I would need to manage for the rest of my life. While not immediately life-threatening, the possibility of future episodes meant long hospital stays would become a part of my reality. Though overwhelmed with anxiety, I found comfort in Andrew's presence. He reassured me that everything would be okay, even when I wasn't so sure. It was during one of those hospital stays that something Andrew said stuck with me. As I reflected on the scarves and gloves I had knitted over the years, now neglected and gathering dust, he casually remarked, "I married you because you're the boss's daughter." The words cut deeper than I expected. It was a thoughtless comment, but it revealed something I hadn't fully grasped. I realized I needed to confront him, to understand how he really felt and to see if we could still cherish our relationship as we once dreamed. Despite Andrew's assurances during my hospital stay, his comforting words didn't fully ease my worries. He promised he would visit whenever he could, holding my hand and offering me reassurance that I would get through this. For a while, he kept that promise, visiting almost daily. He would sit by my side, bring my favorite sewing tools, and we would spend hours stitching together, our conversation filling the silence. Those moments were a welcome escape from the monotony of hospital life. But after about a year, the visits became less frequent. What was once a daily routine turned into an occasional appearance every few weeks. I chalked it up to his overwhelming work schedule, continuing my knitting in his absence. I focused on a scarf I planned to give him the next time he came, thinking that I'd be discharged soon. As the months went by, I also started knitting a pair of gloves to match, each stitch full of love and hope. The day he finally returned, I was eager to present him with the gloves, but when I handed them to him, the response was not what I had hoped for. "Are you still making these? It's annoying," he said flatly, pushing the scarf I had made, perfectly untouched, back into my hands, along with divorce papers. His words were sharper than anything I had ever felt. He explained that he could no longer care for me and that it was time for us to part ways. The divorce papers were signed, and just like that, our journey together was over. I had suspected something was wrong when his visits became less frequent, but the reality of it hit me like a wave. I had convinced myself it was all due to work, that the Andrew I married, the kind and caring man, would never abandon me. But when the visits stopped without explanation, I knew something was deeply wrong. When I asked him, calmly, why he wanted a divorce, it wasn't out of desperation. I had come to terms with the fact that I might have become a burden to him. If he truly wanted this, I was ready to let go. It was painful, but I understood that the life we had once dreamed of sharing was no longer possible. As Andrew's visits grew more infrequent, I couldn't ignore the growing realization that the partnership he had once promised me had slipped into something unrecognizable. Finally, I found the courage to confront him, to ask why everything had changed so drastically. His answer came swiftly and with a biting cruelty. "Isn't it obvious? Ever since I married you, it's been one problem after another. I'm so tired of those scarves and gloves you make every year. Honestly, I only married you because your dad was my boss." He laughed, but it was a harsh, bitter sound, like a slap to my face. His words laid bare a resentment I hadn't known existed, a disdain for the very things I cherished in our life together, things he had once seemed to appreciate. As he vented his anger, I noticed the luxurious, perfectly crafted scarf he wore around his neck, a scarf I hadn't made. It hit me then, with a painful clarity, that perhaps he had never truly valued the gifts I had spent so much time and love creating. Maybe they had always been nothing more than an irritation to him, a fact that wounded me deeply. After I fell ill and my father retired, Andrew's true feelings became even more apparent. In the first year of my illness, he had continued visiting, perhaps out of obligation or to maintain the image of the dedicated husband. At work, he was often praised for his apparent devotion to me, a facade that seemed to benefit him, both in his professional life and among his colleagues. When I confronted him about it, pointing out how his visits seemed more motivated by the need to preserve his image than genuine care for me, he was momentarily stunned. Then, with a kind of reluctant honesty, he admitted that my illness had actually made his life easier at work. This was a painful confirmation of what I had suspected. To Andrew, I was no longer his wife. but a means to an end, something he could use to further his own goals. The truth was a brutal awakening. Throughout my illness, he had played the role of the grieving husband in a way that earned him sympathy and accolades. If I worked late, everyone praised me for being so dedicated, he told me, his voice almost triumphant, and when I needed a break, all I had to say was, "My wife is sick," and I'd get it. It worked out perfectly, he went on, smugly explaining how my illness had even paved the way for his promotion, belittling his colleagues as fools who bought into his story. As he spoke, I didn't recognize the man I had once loved. The stranger before me wore a cruel smile that revealed his true nature. At that moment, I saw our marriage for what it truly was, a carefully constructed lie. Quietly, I accepted the reality. "If my illness was useful to you, then I guess we won't be seeing each other again," I said, my voice steady. Despite the pain, I handed him the divorce papers, and without a second glance, he took them and left, marking the end of our marriage. After he left, the full weight of everything hit me, and I was left to cry alone. Soon after, I was discharged from the hospital and went to stay with my parents. My father was furious when he learned what had really happened. "I can't believe he did this," he said, seething with anger, but by then, I had come to terms with the end of my marriage. I reassured my father, telling him that I wanted to stay with them for a while. My parents were supportive, encouraging me to focus on what made me happy, which, at that moment, was simply being with family. Before moving back for good, I decided to visit our old house one last time. When we arrived, I discovered that the front door lock was broken. We rang the doorbell and were greeted by a stranger who informed us that he had bought the house a few months ago and was now living there with his family. My parents were outraged, but by that point, I had already moved on. The house, just like my marriage, was no longer mine. I chose not to stir up trouble for the new residents and left quietly, but the matter stayed with me, nagging at my thoughts. I couldn't let it go, so I called Andrew to confront him about the house. His response was cold and indifferent. "Yeah, I sold it while you were in the hospital, kept the money for myself. It was my house to begin with," he said, as if it were nothing more than a mundane detail. His words hit me hard, but by then, I had braced myself for his selfishness and had already made the decision to move on without him. His casual tone as he mentioned selling our house only deepened my sense of disillusionment. It was a shock to learn that he had sold the house nearly a year ago, around the time when his visits and concern for me had started to fade. The fact that he made such a major decision without consulting me, especially when we were still legally married and hadn't even finalized the division of assets, was both staggering and infuriating. Though the divorce papers were signed, we had planned to meet the following week to discuss the final details. Andrew, however, had preemptively acted on his own, another betrayal I hadn't expected. When I confronted him over the phone, trying to stay composed, I told him, "You didn't understand anything." His response was confused, as if he had no idea what I was talking about. "What do you mean?" he asked, but I wasn't about to explain it over the phone. "I'll explain next week," I replied and hung up. I turned to my parents, who could see the toll this situation was taking on me. I managed to smile and asked my father for a favor. I laid out my plans, asking for his help to prepare everything we would need for the meeting. "I've already taken care of everything," my father said, offering me a reassuring smile, though I could sense the worry behind it. "We don't have much time before the meeting, but we'll manage." As my father, he likely felt a mix of guilt for introducing me to Andrew and anger at his actions, but his determination to support me was palpable, and I was grateful for that. As the meeting day drew closer, a small, unexpected smile appeared on my face as I thought about Andrew's reaction to what we had prepared. The meeting would take place at my parents' house. My parents and I sat on one side, facing Andrew across from us. Despite knowing how deeply my parents were hurt by what had happened, Andrew seemed completely indifferent, even sneering at times. His behavior wasn't just unrepentant, it was blatantly disrespectful. His arrogance only solidified my resolve. Sitting there with my parents, I felt the weight of all the injustices he had done to me, but I also felt empowered by the support of my family as we prepared to face him together. As the meeting progressed, I maintained my composure, calmly assuring Andrew, "I don't plan to ask for too much." He tried to appear generous, claiming that the money from the house sale would be enough. This statement visibly angered my father, but I placed a gentle hand on his, signaling for him to stay calm. We had the upper hand, and there was no need to escalate things further. "Before we continue, there's something important we need to address," I said, and my father handed me a document. I held it out for Andrew to see. "The house was indeed in your name, but the land it sits on still belongs to my father, who holds the title," I explained, keeping my tone even. Andrew's face tightened into a frown. "So what? The house was still mine. No one can complain. Do you think this is some kind of way to get back at me?" He chuckled dismissively, clearly not understanding the gravity of the situation. It's true that you legally sold the house, I acknowledged, but since the land is still owned by my father, this creates a significant issue for the family who bought the house. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. You sold the house, but as the landowner, my father could legally demand rent from the family currently living there. That would cause them a lot of trouble, wouldn't it? I let the silence hang for a moment, allowing Andrew to absorb the implications. We don't want to cause problems for them, but we can't just let go of our rights to the land without compensation. We intend to offer them the opportunity to purchase the land. We won't force them out or charge rent, but it would be a major issue if they refuse to buy. I continued. Originally, my father intended to gift us this land to build our future, not to have it sold to strangers without any consideration. If the family who bought the house refuses to purchase the land, they could even sue you for being misled, thinking they had full ownership of their new home. Can you imagine how they would feel if they learned there were unexpected costs attached to their dream home? We decided to visit the family who had purchased the house to explain the situation and find a fair resolution. This approach not only safeguarded my family's interests but also showed consideration for the unwitting buyers, aiming to avoid further complications or distress. When we explained the circumstances to the new homeowners, they were surprisingly understanding but firm in their stance. They knew that any legal issues stemming from the sale would fall on the seller, Andrew, and even hinted at the possibility of suing him if we couldn't reach a satisfactory agreement. As I watched Andrew's face drain of color, I could see that he finally understood the gravity of the situation. He was staring at severe financial consequences. In a shaky voice, he asked, "What should I do?" I offered a slight, almost smug smile in return. "The family could buy the land from us, and that would resolve everything, but you'll have to cover the costs. Once they own both the house and the land, all the issues will be settled." I continued, explaining the complications in more detail. They didn't realize the full value of the land when they bought the house, so they might seek compensation from you. It's their decision, and the land itself is in a prime location. It could actually be worth more than the house. Even if you liquidated all your assets, you might not have enough to cover the cost. Alternatively, you could buy back the house and pay for the land, plus a relocation fee for the family. You'd get the house and land back, but after paying the family to relocate, any potential profit would be slim at best. I paused, allowing the weight of the situation to sink in before continuing. And as for alimony, your actions have caused me considerable emotional distress. I intend to pursue compensation for that. You've used me as a pawn in your career, and now that I can see everything for what it truly was, I'm disgusted by it. I plan to seek damages for the emotional harm you've caused me. While the case may not be easy to prove, it's important to address it, especially considering your current predicament. My father, though retired, added his own voice to the conversation, his tone unwavering. I still have plenty of connections from my career. I've spoken to former colleagues who share your opinions and know exactly what you've done. Andrew, you're being talked about behind your back. Everyone's looking down on you, he said with a grim smile, making it clear that Andrew's reputation was slipping. The realization seemed to hit Andrew hard, and for the first time, he looked genuinely unsettled. The status he had carefully built at work, using me as a stepping stone, was now crumbling. Sitting confidently across from him, I clasped my hands together, my smile wide and unrecognizable to him, one he hadn't seen from me in years, especially since our separation. "Now, let's talk about the next steps," I said, my voice calm and steady. Andrew, overwhelmed by the mounting pressure, let out a strained laugh, his eyes filling with tears. As the negotiations continued, it was clear that the advantage was mine. He agreed to pay alimony and compensate for the land on which our house had stood. We later explained this arrangement to the family who bought the house, ensuring they were treated fairly and understood the new terms. In the end, the outcome was favorable for everyone except Andrew. His reputation continued to deteriorate as the rumors my father had subtly spread throughout his company gained momentum, stripping away his status and quashing any hopes of a promotion. Eventually, the pressure became too much, and Andrew resigned from his position. My father later shared this news with me, his satisfaction evident. It was hard not to see it as karma. Andrew's ill-gotten gains, built on exploitation and deceit, had crumbled under the weight of his actions. Now, back at my parents' home, I've found solace and a new sense of purpose. I've started teaching sewing classes, which, though modestly attended by local women and children, have brought me immense joy and fulfillment. I never imagined that teaching this simple craft would bring such peace to my life, but it has. Despite not having children of my own, a dream I once shared with Andrew, I've discovered a new way to share my skills and passion with others. This journey has taught me the resilience of the human spirit and shown me that even without the future I once envisioned, life can still be rich and full of meaning.